do, um, before we get into the presentations, and we do have four of them, um, what I wanted to do was bring to your attention the prompt for the module for assignment. I started talking before about, if you've got some sort of like back issues that you haven't turned in yet, just get a hold of me, explain the situation to me, and we'll work together and figure out some sort of a time frame so that, but you need to do that. Otherwise, it's not fair to your colleagues who are working hard to make those deadlines. I understand a lot of things happen in people's lives that can intrude upon your normal schedule and your ability to make deadlines, but it's your obligation to talk to me to work that out. Okay. I'm not trying to be preachy. I'm just saying I'm trying to be fair to everybody. And yet I want to give everybody the chance to submit their best work. And not everybody is as good at making deadlines as perhaps they ought to be, or because something has come up. But in the prompt for module 4, just because, we're kind of coming up on that time. First of all, it's not due until Tuesday because we've got this nice long weekend, and I do not want people thinking about doing schoolwork during that long weekend. It's a nice breather. Everybody needs a break right now. Hell, I need a break right now, and I love doing this stuff. So I know a lot of you must be real close to burnout, and we don't want that. So it's not due until Tuesday. Maybe the thing to do would be to draft out a possible response, tomorrow or maybe Friday. Let it sit and then revisit it, like on Tuesday morning or something like that. Again, it's not due till 11 o'clock. But the other thing is, all I want you really to do there is any two of the articles, just kind of summarize the key arguments. And then I frame some questions in there it's not that you have to answer those specific questions. I'm just trying to give you some ideas of things that you might want to latch onto from the readings. So hopefully you have a chance to look at that prompt. If it doesn't make sense, shoot me an email and I can clarify it. Otherwise, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. All right. Are there any other questions or anything about where we are or what we're doing? Because we're kind of getting down to it. We're almost done. I don't know about you, but it's been a long year. I teach during the summer and I'm on contract all summer, but my schedule pretty much becomes my own again. And I can kind of like, okay, I'm just going to do nothing but read about violence, or I guess now I have to switch from reading about violence to reading about tolerance, which is not nearly as exciting, but I have to find a way to make it exciting. All right, then why don't we, assuming no other questions, let me get my my note thing here, the presentations, where I can see it. Okay, I guess we'll just take them in order. What's the scoop on Islamic State to start with?
Okay. Is I guess the last name pronunciation doesn't fully matter. Raufer?
It doesn't matter.
Okay. The Raufer article on the Islamic State is really concerned with the understanding of what the essence of the Islamic State or ISIS is as an organization, which has seemed to be lacking in a lot of media coverage and military strategy against the organization. Raufer begins his analysis of this by systematically answering 3 different questions as to the nature of the organization, being, is it a terrorist group? Is it a guerrilla organization? Or is it a caliphate? And is it a caliphate? He concludes that it's not a terrorist organization because of their sheer amount of military grade weaponry that they have available to them, highlighting that no terrorist organization to date has ever possessed more tanks than the French military, and that its main successes in the field have been more military successes and not what would be typically considered a terrorist success, which he doesn't actually give an example of in that regard.
I'm going to interrupt just for a second. That is an embedded joke by that writer. It's true.
Yeah.
But the reason he mentions that is because historically the French are generally considered to have invented the tank.
Yeah.
So he's being very, very humorous.
Kind of facetious in that. Yeah. So then he moves on to answering the next question, which is whether or not it's a guerrilla organization. And again, he suggests that it's not a guerrilla organization due to the fact that ISIS takes root in areas that it fights in, which is not a common characteristic of guerrilla movements. They tend to leave a territory after an attack. The question of whether or not ISIS is a caliphate is more complex, and Raufer states that ISIS sees itself as a caliphate while lacking key components for what that would actually entail if it were, critically being that it lacks physical territory or a state that it actually controls. Raufer again then asks if it's not a terrorist organization, not a guerrilla organization, or a true caliphate, then what is it, who is it serving, and what purpose does it serve? And he answers this question by stating that it's a mercenary army. And he demonstrates this through the discussion of its founding leader and current and former leaders, and the contradiction and alliances that they've formed and the attacks that they've engaged in. And he's also concerned with the structure of the higher ups in the organization. So ISIS describes itself as a caliphate, and it's often described as a rogue sect of Sunni Islam or the Salafists. And so the Salafist enemies on paper tend to include those who are secular, different nationalists, and practitioners of Shia Islam. And the goal for them is to establish a caliphate through jihad. However, most of the top leaders and strategists within ISIS are former military leaders for Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad. Former ISIS head, one of the former heads of ISIS was a former brigadier general for Saddam Hussein, and its founding leader established connections with both the Baathists and the Sufis in Iraq in the early 2000s, including one of Hussein's most loyal generals. So what Raufer suggests with all this information then is that there are just all these really unusual alliances for a group that should be finding these people to be at odds with the ideals of a Salafist caliphate. Raufer, near the end of the article, kind of begins to make a connection that he doesn't like clearly state, but he brings Iran into the equation, really trying to get at everything that ISIS has done in Iraq and Syria and within the region is clearly benefiting someone. And if it's not benefiting those groups there, who's it benefiting? And he suggested it's Iran. It almost seemed to me like he was sort of suggesting that they were a mercenary army for Iran, but doesn't explicitly say that. But that's what it seemed like he was tiptoeing around, which would be really interesting because Iran is like seen as like a Shia Islam state, which would not go with like this particular sect that claims to be like a rogue Sunni sect. But this suggestion that he's kind of tiptoeing around, he makes documentation of through different ISIS leaders seeking refuge in places like Jordan and Iran while fleeing altercations with the US and Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s. And while Raufer doesn't explicitly state that Iran plays a key role in the understanding of the perpetuation of ISIS as a group, he does state that they're important and that ISIS is a mercenary army. And to figure out what group or state they're answering to, he suggests that there really needs to be more of an analysis on the influences of the leaders that have formed ISIS. And that's just kind of where he leaves it, just pretty open-ended.
Okay. That's a pretty solid analysis of that article. He is absolutely saying it. Okay. Has said elsewhere, his reasoning for the argument, it is interesting. He's done some interesting work. Okay. Yeah. And of course, a lot of this is moot because you notice this was a 2016 article. Nobody's talking about Islamic State anymore.
Yeah.
Because they've pretty much run out of gas. But his argument is still compelling. In some ways, even more so, because his point is exactly what you suggested. Most people assume, oh, well, they're trying to create this pan-Islamic caliphate, and there's a certain kind of Islam, and there's this and that. The one thing I wish he had done, and I actually got sort of like sniped at once in a conference for suggesting this, that a lot of terrorist organizations were using Islam in a way that a lot of, for want of a better term, sort of quasi-left-wing thugs were using Marxism-Leninism as a mobilizing secular religion in order to put together these insurgent guerrilla forces and things like that. In that, most of these people are not, deeply committed Muslims, the leadership. A lot of them they're university educated, or they're as he pointed out, some of them have a lot of technical training and things like that. And to that extent, they're really more secular.
Right.
A lot of times their invocation of religion is pretty hypocritical. Um, and so that's his argument, that yeah, they were essentially kind of guns for hire that Iran was using. What he's not saying is that they were created by Iran.
Right.
But this is, you're right, Pamela, this is where he's not being very clear. He's kind of trying to be, he doesn't want to be laughed out of the room, which is what happens when you have a position that isn't popular. Because, the thing about experts and scholars and all that, they're just the same herds of sheep as anybody else. And they will latch on to a fashionable narrative. And if you don't replicate that narrative in your own work, and I speak from experience, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting published. You're going to have a lot of trouble getting taken seriously. And if you're an academic, you're going to have a lot of trouble with tenure and promotion. I don't know how many of you have noticed that, nearing retirement, I am still only an associate professor.
Mm-hmm.
There's a real good reason for that. Okay. I gave up trying to get published in mainstream political science because I'm not interested in those arguments anymore. And it's more fun for me to develop arguments that I think have substance and share them with students than it is to try and publish for a bunch of squareheads. So, that happens. A lot of us just withdraw from that. It's not a lack of interest or a lack of effort or anything else. And Robert's kind of the same kind of person where he's just like, look, this is what I do. I'm an expert, take it or leave it.
Right.
So it is a controversial thesis, but I would suggest that the more we learn about Islamic State as they've disintegrated, the more compelling his argument becomes, And why wouldn't that be the case? How many times, did the United States latch on to an insurgent movement and supply them with logistics and guns and everything else and keep a war going, to meet their own ends rather than being interested in whatever these insurgents, purported to want to do? How many times have we backed a dictatorship, not really caring what they do with their own people, but simply because it advances our own interests? He's
Right.
using that logic. So essentially he's saying this is an example of state-sponsored terrorism. But what he's not saying is it wouldn't have existed without Iran. What he's saying is it expanded as compellingly as it did, and they were able to amass a standing army that could take and keep territory, in large part because of patronage from Iran. Okay? It's an interesting argument. And by the way, it's absolutely consistent with the kinds of logic that we used during the Cold War. It's just that the wild card here is Islam, that somehow that's supposed to be this set aside that, well, no, religion doesn't work that way. He's saying, yes, of course it does.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a means to an end for these people. Maybe not the rank and file, but it's a way of keeping the ants in line. Absolutely. That was a very solid summary. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions on that? It is a different way of thinking about Islamic State. Some of you may already be seeing Islamic State kind of receding in the rearview mirror of your life, and you might not even know, well, what is this even about? It's evaporated that quickly. You never hear people in the headlines anymore talking about ISIS. And a couple of years ago, it was, many people thought that, the principal threat, which, by the way, it never was to anybody but that region of the world. Never. People are going to self-radicalize all over the world. That doesn't mean that Islamic State was actually reaching into their brains and manipulating them, much less giving them guns and orders, So it's an interesting perspective. It's different from the kind that you're normally going to get in orthodox or mainstream scholarship and journalism. And so I thought it was useful. This guy is not a lunatic. This is an expert, very knowledgeable, and has written but he writes on that fringe where it's like, look, here's the path less well trodden. Consider this as an alternative, and has had some really compelling analyses that at least really serious people, often people in the field, are listening to. He's the kind of person who will go and talk to the CIA and things like that. He's serious. Okay. Yeah, that was nice. Thank you. What about then another iteration of this argument? What's this article about with respect to state support for terrorism?
Okay. Yeah, the state supports for terrorism. It's Farouk Ekmeksi, right?
That's close enough.
So the overall argument that he's presenting is that these terrorist organizations are not non-state actors as they're commonly thought of, but more state-sponsored, or at least many of them are state-sponsored. And he makes the argument mercenary armies, same as the last article. He gives three cases for this: the Syrian support for the Kurdish PKK and the Iranian support for the Palestinian Hamas, as well as the American support for Iranian and the Iranian MEK. So some of his main points were that terrorism has no agreed on definition, which makes it harder to study, as well as also leads a lot of people to make the misconception that he claims is that most terrorist organizations are non-state actors. He gives the reasons why states support terrorism for reasons like ideology, religion, and like domestic concerns.
Hey, Jason, I'm sorry. I don't mean to break the flow, but this is kind of an important distinction. And I didn't want to say it because I wanted to wait and see if you wanted to jump on it. But the first article kind of rejects the idea of Islamic State being a terrorist organization because they use conventional means and they have a standing army and everything else. The difference with Ekmetsi is the argument that doesn't negate the possibility of them carrying out acts of terrorism, just because it's not asymmetrical warfare as we normally understand it. So that the discussion there, for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at this yet, is on page 126, where the discussion of terrorism, just to underscore that. Sorry, Jason, I'm really sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, you're good. So yeah, he gives the reasons for states supporting terrorism, and then he also underlines that terrorism has recently been more used as a war by other means, which goes back to the title of the article, and how it allows like plausible deniability and an alternative to like and a less devastating way of attacking enemies. He gives examples of that specifically when he talks about each case individually. Did you want me to go in depth onto each? Because he goes in depth on. Oh, you're muted.
Muted there. I'm just trying to be quiet. I don't need you to go into tremendous depth because that's the work of your colleagues. But if you could it is useful to give us just a very brief flyover of that.
Okay.
Like a sentence or two on each.
Okay. He, for the first one, goes over the Iranian and the Hamas, and he says that they really are just funding them as like a leveraging, as leverage in bargaining against the U.S. and Israel. And then Syria and the PKK, he cites that they do commit terrorist acts and that they're opposed to Turkey with the Kurdish, but they're more just using them as leverage in negotiations because they don't give Kurdish in their own country the same rights that the Kurdish are fighting for in Turkey. And then the U.S. supporting the MEK. There's lobbyists in the U.S. supporting them to get taken off the terrorist list by the CIA, and they're taking a more lenient approach with them than other terrorist organizations that have done similar things because they're useful to them in destabilizing enemies, specifically, I think it was Iraq. I'm forgetting which one it was, Iraq or Iran. He concludes the article by talking about how well, here's a good quote that I wanted to say. The presence of imminent, real or perceived threats to national security increases state leaders' willingness to support foreign terrorist organizations that work against their enemies, which kind of summarizes his main argument of why states support terrorism or terrorist organizations and why they're not really non-state actors. They're used as mercenaries in kind of Cold Wars ever since the end of the Cold War. That was really the real turning point for when this all started. And it's basically, he just reiterates that it's a cheaper way of fighting wars that they don't want to fight themselves. And then at the very end, he either says people should accept terrorism as a human condition or that they need to better define it and create a more cohesive fight against it with members of the community, because states support these kind of organizations, and it makes it kind of a gray area.
Okay, again, really solid, concise summary of a fairly complex argument. You identified his key thesis, but more than that, I mean, we could have just glanced in the first page and found that. What you did though was you amplified on and illustrated it. So that was very effective. That was good work. In fact, you know what? I'm going to embarrass you for just a second here and say that, I was looking over the score sheets here. You've done consistently better on every one of your assignments. That's a good thing to see. So there, I've embarrassed you. I used to hate when people would do that with me, but I think it's nice work. Again, the key here to this, as Jason pointed out, is first of all, we're getting hung up on these kind of antiseptic definitions that are sometimes dysfunctional of exactly what terrorism is, and somehow that we obviate the possibility that terrorism can include not only direct state action but also state support, that is part of what terrorism is. Also, Jason did a good job of pulling in the idea of, look, in terms of tactics and strategy for great powers, this is just a continuation of the Cold War. They used to be called, brush fire wars or proxy wars or things like that, where you get some other small army or some other group of insurgents or somebody to do your fighting for you. I mean, the Soviet Union had no compelling reason to get involved in Southeast Asia, except that we were stuck there. And so they helped support North Vietnam and indirectly then supported the Viet Cong. They didn't share any of the aspirations of those people. They didn't seek to liberate them. They didn't give a shit about them. They just knew that they were going to bleed the United States. That's why we supported the Mujahideen in their Vietnam, which was Afghanistan. Okay, it's the same reason. We didn't care about the Mujahideen. We didn't care about the people of Afghanistan. We cared about crippling the Soviet Union's ability to manage, to project force and manage territory outside of the Soviet Union. And the argument here, as Jason suggested, is that's still going on. That's, Iran's going to sponsor this, so we're going to sponsor the MEK because they're trying to destabilize Iran. It's just a continuation of the same kind of, dirty tactics and insurgency and stuff that characterized the Cold War. Okay. So again, it's not terrorism as we normally think about it, but it's an interesting perspective that makes a lot of sense in terms of international relations and the realities on the ground instead of what you're liable to hear in some headline on the news or, some conversation at a bar. Okay. So that was good. Questions or comments on that? Okay. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jason.
No, I just wanted to point out that I thought it was kind of funny that he gave the U.S. Code for Federal Regulations for Terrorism, and then pointed out how our bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima fit exactly into it.
Yeah, I was smart ass. Well, what? Like the law applies to us? We're the Donald Trump of the world. The law doesn't apply to us. But no, obviously there's a lot of vinegar behind this. There's a lot of rage here, but it's controlled and solid scholarship. This is one of those areas where I was talking in class yesterday and mentioning that one of the case studies I wanted to use for development and the problematics of development was the current situation in Ethiopia with Tigray province and all that. But I made the decision not to. And the reason for that is I don't like to teach things when I have an axe to grind. I don't like to teach things when I feel like I got a dog in the fight. And I have a dog in that fight and all that. Here we have someone who clearly has a dog in the fight, and yet the scholarship is relatively objective. Okay, it's pretty solid. Again, not a common analysis, not the kind of thing you're typically going to hear from American talking hairdos and things like that. But this is good, solid scholarship, and it resonates very powerfully with the experts in the field and on the ground. Okay, so yeah, nice job. All right, we're doing well. This is good. Okay, now this next piece shifts gears a little bit in that we go kind of to a lot of assumptions about within America about what terrorism is or isn't, and about what the real magnitude of the threat may or may not be. So let's take a look at that.
Okay, yes. So I got to read the article addressing the myths of terrorism in America. So it's pretty interesting, just from growing up post 9/11 and having kind of a lot of different understandings through school and what a lot of people talked about in the media. So it's kind of nice to read this through. So the authors mainly discuss social perception versus actual reality and goes into detail about 6 myths that were mainly caused from 3 kind of main reasonings or why there's misconceptions of terrorism. And so they debunk 6 myths that were created due to media coverage, also from just fear that was like created after 9/11, and also other terrorist acts, but mainly because of 9/11. And then also from a political viewpoint or political agendas of presidents and governors and everything there. So yeah, so the authors used 2 databases for the study. And so it was taken from the extremist crime database, which actually was created by 2 of the authors. So I thought that was interesting. And then also from the global terrorism database. So the first database is mainly just data or only data from the US. And then the second one is from across the world. So it's nice that they incorporated that as well. So their main goal was to better understand extremist crime in the US and how it causes fear. And so, yeah, so the 6 myths that they talked about is number 1, that terrorism is on the rise. And they were able to incorporate data from the databases and a lot of further study that is actually not true. So, yes, it occurred, terrorism did rise immediately post 9/11, but since then it's actually decreased. So that was really interesting to hear. And this was posted, or yeah, released in 2020, so it's very current. And then also, so moving on, number 2, fatalities are on the rise. So there's a lot more deaths that happen from terrorist acts. And so that's also not true. It's really hard to predict when the next terrorist act is going to happen, and they're super rare, is what the article mentions. They note as a black swan act, so 9/11 and also the Oklahoma City bombing were black swan acts. And so those were 2 of the largest like fatality terrorist acts. But since then, a lot of them are like very little deaths, if any, which was really interesting. The third one is that international terrorism, international terrorism is, or like, yeah, sorry, I'm mixing up my words. So international terrorism is more on the rise as well instead of domestic terrorism, which actually is not true. According to their data, they say that more terrorist attacks are actually domestic, which is really interesting too, because you kind of like think because of 9/11, like growing up in school, that's kind of what we were told. And so it's really cool that they did this study. They also mentioned, kind of backtracking here, that there's a lot of the articles that came out about terrorism were really immediately after 9/11. And so they didn't have a ton of data to go on. And they were also quite a bit of like politically viewed and not very neutral on that. So they kind of went in with a very neutral viewpoint. Number 4 is that jihadist inspired attacks pose the greatest threat. And that was a really interesting one as well. And according to the data, is actually the least common threat. Jihadist inspired attacks were the least common. The greatest was actually far right. And then second was the far left. Jihadist threats or attacks actually peaked in 2002, so right after 9/11. But since then, it hasn't even compared to the right. If you like get into the article, they provide all of the data and percentages, which is a little confusing. And I did want to note that they did say, like, they use the term like according to all Americans, or kind of like took data and said like all Americans like from that. And I thought that's interesting because they took data from 2015 and obviously it wasn't all Americans, because obviously I wasn't a part of that. So it is kind of like a confusing where they like grouped all Americans, had like said that they were fearful for attacks from like international terrorism and all of that. So I thought I would mention.
Let me interrupt for just a second. When you say they use the expression all Americans,
Mhm.
where do they say that?
I wrote it in my notes here, but I will have to look through the article. It's like about 20 pages, so I would like to find it, but it is in some of the studies here. Let me see if I can search it. They do say, so the majority of Americans,
Right.
in one of them, but I mean, there's no like data for that, how many, they don't like mention how many people they surveyed for that too.
That's fair. That's fair. That was what I was waiting to see, is if you were concerned. Now, I think it's either this or another version of this that I have from a conference where they actually show the surveys that they used. They
Okay.
show the surveys that they used. My recollection is it's mentioned here, but it's not clear. But what let's see. Sorry, I'm
Oh no, that's
kind of
okay.
doing this on the fly, but it's an important point to raise, though, that methodologically, I always encourage people to be not data deniers, but data skeptics. Just because somebody says the data will say something, don't just buy it because of that. So the idea here is that what they're borrowing from are existing surveys at the time. They're using, in some of their other work, they've used Pew data, they've used the general elections data, the national election studies of the University of Michigan and things like that. So they're not making this stuff up, but you're right. There's a
Oh, yeah,
little bit
no, I
of
know. Yeah, I mean, I
imprecision
know
here.
this, but it is like interesting. Just kind of like another one I found was they said nearly half of Americans, but they didn't provide like out of how many Americans they surveyed. So I mean, you could technically survey 2 people and get half there. So,
But yeah, okay. So that's,
I just
but
wanted
just
to.
in fairness, that's not what they did.
Well, I know, of course they didn't. I mean, that would be ridiculous, but also it is like an idea that you can't believe everything that's posted. So that's what they kind of talk about in the media too, because the media is like probably the #1 cause for why all these misconceptions of terrorism happen.
Mhm.
And I thought it was worth mentioning. Okay, so then I'll get on to I think I'm on number 5 here. So number 5 is that most terrorist attacks were from Arab descent. They proved that wrong in their data as well, that the demographics actually showed that it was primarily from white people that were terrorist acts. So that was interesting as well. And then finishing up with number 6, that terrorist violence was carried out by organized groups. And so they actually found that only 30% of terrorist acts that happened were by organized groups, and mainly they're from lone wolves. So I thought that was interesting as well. So kind of just like the closing point is that the article says that policies should be looked into for preventing encountering violence, but they should be really more looking into reducing fear and anxiety because of all of the myths that they were able to prove, that we're spending a ton of money on trying to like prevent terrorist acts and have security measures in place, which is very important, they say, but also that we should be really focusing on valid information and posting valid information and not posting things to cause fear in Americans.
Well, one of the things that comes out of this, yeah, that's a good solid summary, but one of the things that isn't, I think that this generation in particular struggles with is the distinction between journalism and social media, because they're not the same thing. And I think that partly is a consequence of the focus of people here, but it seems like we've almost internalized this lack of distinction between journalism and just people saying things, or as you say, posting things. Journalists don't post things. Journalists research things, okay? And that's what they're trying to say. I just think you're right in that they're not saying it very clearly,
I agree, but also I did read that like there was a lot of articles that were posted, like journalist articles that were posted with lack of data, and that it wasn't based on a lot of studies, and that they didn't go into depth about it. And so that's the kind of the point of their article, was to prove that a lot of articles that were posted do cause fear in people because they're not based on a lot of studies. They do have a political agenda. And yes, with social media and stuff, it's a
Okay,
lot
first
different.
of all, no, it's not necessarily accurate to criticize a journalist for having a political agenda. That is
I didn't
remarkable.
say they were criticizing. I just said that they were like kind of to actually have data that they took from 2 databases.
Okay, well, no, you might be blurring two things is what I'm trying to say. In other words, there's what journalists write, okay? Journalists typically do not pursue a political agenda. It's trained out of you as a journalist. What happens though, particularly in television, that's not journalism. Like when you watch MSNBC, that's not journalism, that's commentary. They are transparently pushing an agenda. But your objection is appropriate because one of the things that's not clarified in this, I like this study, but there's a lot in it that's left kind of ambiguous. And one of those things is the idea of they're not distinguishing between political commentary and journalism in the same way that they're not distinguishing between journalism and just what people post or retweet or whatever in social media. So when they say the media, there's this kind of blurring. It's not distinct, and that's, I think, the source of your frustration with this piece is that, what are they really saying when they're saying media? What are they really saying when they're saying journalism? You know, somebody who's paid to be an anchor on MSNBC or Fox News is not a journalist. Okay, they're not interested in getting the story right. They're interested in getting eyeballs on the screens, and that's a fact on the ground. That's not journalism. Okay. And that I think is what you're objecting to, or frustrated. Well, I don't say you're objecting to it, but you're frustrated. Yeah. Is that right?
Yep.
I think that's perfectly appropriate. And
Yeah.
just as you say, when they say, well, X% of Americans agree with this, it is, they've imperfectly cited. And the only thing is, I know they've done this because I know the pieces they're citing, but for the general reader, they'd look at that and say just exactly what you said appropriately. I wish more people were that skeptical to say, well, wait a minute, how do we know that, most Americans believe this or 60% of Americans believe this? Well, what they really should have done is clarified that the way a good journalist is supposed to clarify that by saying, according to a recent survey conducted by, and in a footnote or something you have what the margin of the error of the survey was and the sample size and all the things you pointed out. So I wasn't suggesting that you were wrong in your observations. I'm trying to clarify them sort of methodologically and find out, well, yeah, this is a frustrating piece. I included this as a reading because it's the kind of piece that generally gets people talking. And this is good because I'm thrilled to hear people who can look at scholarly work and say, wait a minute, I'm not completely sold on this. You're not rejecting it out of hand, but you're saying you haven't proven your case to me yet. And that shows a resilience that you can't just you can't just convince me of anything. You've got to really give me something to think about. One of the problems in the United States right now, of course, is that there's a sizable component of the American adult population that doesn't have that kind of healthy skepticism, what I would refer to as informed skepticism. In other words, Campbell, you knew why you were skeptical. You weren't just saying, well, this is a liberal newspaper, so I don't believe it. You were saying, you didn't give me all the numbers here. You didn't give me complete data. Yeah.
I guess I was looking at the terrorism scholarship section. That's kind of where I based that off of, where they just posted or wrote that systematic review of terrorism, political violence literature found that over 50% of peer-reviewed articles between 1971 and 2002 were published in just 2 years. And despite the interest, they suffered from weak methodological designs, including a few quantitative studies. And so, I mean, we're supposed to use peer-reviewed articles in a lot of our research. So,
well, they are peer-reviewed. In other words, you can be peer-reviewed as a scholar without using numbers. Okay, but what they're saying is, in order to really think about this and measure an order of magnitude of something like incidents of terrorism or the intensity of violence and the number of casualties, things like that, requires quantitative analysis as well. And what they're really saying here, and this is perfectly legitimate, and again, a source of skepticism, is a lot of the so-called experts were counterterrorism experts. So they've already made up their minds. In other words, there used to be a separate class of terrorism at SOU taught within the criminology department, criminology and criminal justice. Okay, and because of insufficient enrollments, they asked if I would just take the crim students who wanted to study terrorism. Okay, we studied it completely differently because in criminology it was a class in counterterrorism, making the assumption already, well, we know what terrorism, and I'm not saying they were doing it wrong. In fact, that's been the consensus. Okay, but I think you've probably noticed that most of what we're looking at here hasn't got anything to do with counterterrorism. It has everything to do with trying to figure out, okay, what is terrorism, what motivates it, what prolongs it, what sustains it, what supports it. Because only if we know those things can we move in the direction of saying, what can we do about it? And I think, Camry, that's what I hear you saying in a sense is,
Yeah.
we need more precision here. Yeah?
Yeah, well, I am a criminology student, so that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And you're approaching it, see, but you're not approaching it as an ideologue or as a, an anti-Muslim or anything like that. You're approaching it as a scholar. And you're saying, well, give me the data. I'll draw my own conclusions. Thank you very much, but give me the data. And
For the clarification.
and I'm not saying, again, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that there's not a place for counterterrorism studies. What I'm saying is, and I think what they're trying to say and didn't say very well, almost all of that massive volume of stuff that came out was, here's what's wrong. Here's what we can do about it. Remember when we were talking about, sort of positivism and counterterrorism and profiling and all that kind of stuff? That article suggests that's what carried the day. It was never the sense of, well, how much of this is blowback from bad foreign policy, from us going in and destabilizing the country. Again, it doesn't justify it, but if we can explain it, then we know better how to counter it, rather than just saying, well, it's a war on terror. You can't have a war on terror. You can't win it, because there are always going to be people with grievances that are sufficient enough that they're going to pick up bombs and guns, or they're going to make them themselves. Yeah. I like the spirit of informed critique in that. I like that article demands it. So that was kind of refreshing to hear. Any other questions? I mean, it raises a lot of questions and a lot of concerns, including about, as Cambridge suggested, about the integrity of terrorism scholarship itself, which I think is really important, hence my inclusion of the article. Yeah, nice work. Okay, so let me make a note real quick. Sorry, it's so hard for me to talk and write at the same time. I'm just one of those people who's like unable to think and do. Okay, any other you pretty much covered it. Was there anything else you wanted to add, or are you pretty good? Okay, that's solid stuff. Good. Okay, and no other questions about that? Please give that article a read. Again, these articles, I positioned them at this point in the class because by now, if you've applied yourself to the readings, you've got enough background to begin to do what Cambry was just doing, what all of you have done to a certain extent, to look at these things and not just vacuum them up, but look at them critically and critique them. By the way, to critique something doesn't mean to find negativity in it. It means you're analyzing it, using your critical thinking capacities, which is what we just did. And that makes for a much more interesting analysis. Okay. All right, we've got one more then, I think. Yeah, politicians and hate speech. Now, there's a theme here before we get into this. Okay. There is a theme here, and it is, to what extent are establishment politicians or others in the bureaucracy of the state facilitating terrorism? This article implies that as well. In other words, journalists, where do they get their information? Well, they get it from the Defense Intelligence Agency, or they get it from Homeland Security, or they get it from the CIA. They don't have the security clearances to go and do these analyses themselves. I mean, as soon as you start cracking open these data sets and asking for freedom of information, disclosures and stuff like that, a file is started. Don't think it isn't, because it is. Okay, the state's always involved in this. Okay, so another way of looking at that is this next article that we're going to look at, which is, this if the extent that there is some connection, between sort of political rhetoric and other things. So what do we got?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, I just want to say, please bear with me. I am working on dorm Wi-Fi, so if I freeze, we'll figure it out.
Okay, first thing
Um,
to do if you're worried about it would be to kill your video.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. So this article, Politician Hate Speech and Domestic Terrorism, is by James Piazza. And basically the main question of the entire article is, does hate speech fuel domestic terrorism? And so he begins with explaining that this concept really started and stemmed from the mass shooting that took place in August of 2019 in El Paso, Texas, that killed 22 people. And the suspect, minutes before the attack, posted a large manifesto online that cited a lot of hate speech that had been furthered by the president, Donald Trump, at the time. And so the very beginning of the article was just analyzing like a lot of Trump's rhetoric and a lot of right-wing politicians and their anti-Latino and like anti-immigration rhetoric and the effect that that has had on political violence specifically. And so in the very beginning of the article, he's talking a lot about other studies that were done, not his own. And the other studies that were done showed that there was a correlation between hate speech and violence, but didn't necessarily show that there was a correlation between hate speech and domestic terrorism, not because it wasn't present, but because that's not what they were studying for. And he specifically says that this type of correlation is not unique to the United States. He mentions anti-Muslim violence that happens in India and violence that happens in Pakistan shortly after incidences of politicians and hate speech and harmful rhetoric. And then he lays out the two like main points of his article, like the findings of his article, which is one, that countries featuring more frequent use of hate speech by politicians are more likely to experience an increase in subsequent domestic terrorist attacks. And then secondly, that the impact of hate speech by political parties on domestic terrorism is mediated through increased political polarization. So there's really like a two-prong approach to this whole study that he lays out. And it's first studying the correlation between hate speech and domestic terrorist attacks, and then also studying the correlation between domestic terrorist attacks and political polarization. So he looks at this through like he has two different models. So the first model is it's like a cross-sectional time series sample, he calls it, studying between 135 and 163 different countries from 2000 to 2017. And it ranks it's called the Political Parties Hate Speech Indicator. And it ranks the presence of hate speech from often or extremely often, sometimes, rare, and never or almost never. And the findings that he found was that in around 15% of observations, politicians are rated as using hate speech often or extremely often. The use of hate speech occurs sometimes in about 33.4% of observations. Hate speech is rare in about 34.8% of observations and is reported as never or almost never in about 16.4% of observations.
Can I
So
interrupt?
hate speech is
doing this, I
present.
know. Hold on. If you
No,
look at those percentages, that means that only about half
Mhm.
of politicians avoid this. That means it's widely used.
yeah,
That's one way to interpret those data.
yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted to kind of lean
Mhm.
into that because that's kind of startling. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was definitely interesting reading it and seeing just how prevalent it actually is. Um, and so he did tie this to the like an increase of violence and terrorism. And he said that the reason that he believes that that happens is because one, hate speech helps to fuel political tribalism and allows for the dehumanization of out-group members, um, which can justify of violent rhetoric has to do with these people are coming and they're coming now and you have to do something about it. And so that is part of the reason why specifically politicians and their hate speech are helping to fuel violence. And then the second part of his study was he had a scale for polarization that was a similar like 4-point scale with the same like often, extremely often, sometimes, rare, and never, or never. Or sorry, no, I was reading his polarization also a 4, but it has the polarization. He's around 23.8% of year observations, because he scanned like viewed these over a year, are characterized as exhibiting severe polarization. Around 30.8% exhibit moderate polarization, 23.1% have medium polarization, and 20.7% exhibit limited polarization. And then there's only 1% that has no polarization at all. So as you can see, like there's quite a lot of, like it's over 50% of the countries that he was observing have moderate to severe polarization. And while he determined that hate speech is a positive, significant predictor of subsequent domestic terrorist attacks, and hate speech is a significant predictor of polarization as well, and polarization is a significant predictor of domestic terrorism, interestingly, and this kind of confused me despite those links, is that he found that hate speech, like that polarization mediates the impact of hate speech on terrorism, which was very interesting to me and didn't really make sense. But he says that hate speech boosts political polarism or political polarization that then makes domestic terrorism more likely. And that's like pretty much the big end to his article, is that a significant indicator of domestic terrorism and political polarization is that hateful rhetoric from upper level politicians. And this is specifically in his article, he mentioned that he's not analyzing just party affiliates or like extremists within a party. This is party operatives that are in large like positions of power that have a lot of influence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a couple of things there. One of the things, Rachel, that might have been understandably confusing you a little bit was the use of the word mediate. Because a lot of times when we hear that word mediate, we think of that as something that kind of, attenuates something, that minimizes it. And that's not how he's using the word. So that might be part of it. What he's saying is essentially, if you think of the word mediate, that is the environment within which something occurs, or think about medium used in art. What's the medium you're using to create that art? He's using mediate more in that sense of the word. So that might have been understandably what was throwing you. What he's trying to say essentially is that in a polarized environment, that creates this heat, okay? if you introduce into that hate speech, then it's like this catalytic reaction. Okay, it interacts with the medium of polarization or within the environment of polarization, whereas it might not if we were not terribly polarized, because in that instance, we might find that we ourselves would do the attenuation and think, like we did, for example, 1964, Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater infamously says, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Okay, that's an extraordinary thing to say, and it's not the kind of thing that in 1964, after the assassination of the president, you want to hear from a presidential candidate. Okay, in other words, we were not extremely polarized at that time. The polarization was regional in the 60s. It was kind of the South and everybody else in that sense, or the South and, different parts of the country, but mostly the South. If you look at how well George Wallace did in 1968, for example, his base of support was the old Confederacy, essentially parts of the old Confederacy. And so what happened was there was nothing to facilitate, that inflammatory rhetoric and guide it into violence. That the more likely occurrence at that time was that the rhetoric, the violent rhetoric, was liable to have come from the left. Okay, it was, a lot of it was kind of, goofy college level Marxism, Leninism, and what the Stanley Crash referred to as the trickle down Marxism of the Black Panthers and stuff like that. And that was inflammatory, and it did in some cases, lead to to incidents of violence. Okay, the environment within which that language was used was significantly different, and politicians used it much less frequently, especially outside of the South. If you were in the Deep South, you routinely heard what we today would describe as hate speech. Outside of the South, you just didn't hear that. I mean, that's not an oversimplification. I think that's pretty generally true. Okay, that's no longer the case. What isn't explained here and has shown up in other studies, and this is what a lot of you from sort of right of center are not going to like, is that overwhelming the use of what is classified as hate speech is being used by right-wing politicians, overwhelmingly. So then it is no surprise that most of the politically motivated violence we're seeing, insofar as it is politically motivated, is coming from the right. Okay, and this ties into, our other discussions of domestic terrorism. I mean, the idea that, most of these incidents in the United States are not, Islamic extremists or Antifa or some mythic organization that hardly exists. It's the right, and it has been for most of American history. And so when you have that environment within which the reactionary right in the United States has always felt more empowered to exercise violent extremism, and then you add to that politicians who are not only willing but often eager to use this incendiary speech in order to galvanize support, okay, then this is the consequence. So that's sort of the argument here. That's the point of it, I guess. Okay. Yeah. Any questions?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that it's also important to note, well, and I appreciate you mentioning the mediate thing, because that was confusing me, because I was like, all of the data points to the fact that it does correlate, and then this to say mediate. So yeah, but I think that's also important to note that I forgot to say when I was first going over it, is that he acknowledged the idea that there could be some sort of outside factor that is causing these two to be correlated. And so he actually ran 5 different versions of the study to account for any outside factors, and all of them pointed that hate speech is a positive, significant predictor of domestic terrorist attacks.
Right, and what that's classic social science hypothesis testing. In other words, when you're testing a hypothesis, some of you know from doing 498 with me or 311 when I used to teach it, testing hypotheses is not just about finding an argument that you agree with and then selecting data and literature to support that. You've got to have a strong analysis, you have to allow for competing explanations and then test whether or not, as objectively as you can, your explanation is as strong or stronger than any of the prevailing competing explanations for, a given phenomenon of any kind. So that, yeah, I think it's okay that you didn't mention that. It is the kind of thing, though, that I would hope would would become apparent to people, very similar to the kind of data skepticism that Cambridge was sharing with us in her analysis, that you always be, when I say skeptical, it's sort of like that weird thing of mediating. What I don't mean is just disbelieve everything if you don't like the sound of it. But I think what Professor Novak was sharing with us was there's a time to be cautious about how to interpret data. And that is when you're going to extrapolate meaningful conclusions from it. You want to make sure that you have a good faith analysis. It's the same thing with this. In other words, the author gives you the chance to consider competing explanations and then, purports to establish as a premise that this particular explanation, tying in hate speech seems to be the most compelling. But you're also welcoming other scholars to come in, replicate those findings, look at those. That's why they tell you, here are our data sets. That's why Cambridge got frustrated with this, the inability or the failure of the scholars in the previous article to include their public opinion data. That's not fair. You got to help us. You got to let me crunch those numbers too, maybe. So yeah, I think it's fine that you didn't mention it. It certainly is implicit in the work, and as you read through it, though, do notice that. I mean, that's classic social science hypothesis testing. Yeah, okay. Well, really uniformly solid presentations today. I think sometimes it takes a while, but I think we've kind of figured out how to do this. It really, makes my day easier. I mean, you must notice that I'm talking a little bit less today than would normally be the case. That's kind of nice. I still actually have a voice, which is cool. All right. Any questions, comments, observations about any of the material that we covered today? Anything that uses certain words or concepts that doesn't quite square? The presentations were solid. You should get a pretty good idea. If you took good notes from those, and I won't say you're feeling lazy, but you're feeling somewhat uninspired, you probably got enough insight, if you were listening, that you could analyze those articles in good faith. Now, you're cheating in the sense that you're relying on your colleagues to do your work for you, but it is America, and that's the way we work. That's a terrible thing to say, and I'm absolutely glad that I said it. All right. Just then, a reminder, let me get back to here. The assignment is due, but it's not due Sunday. It's not due until Tuesday. I want you to have that weekend. I want you to recharge your batteries a little bit. Hopefully, maybe get out and hang out with your friends. It's supposed to be hot. It's supposed to get some nice warm weather. Get outside, go see your family, hang out with your friends, whatever. And then on Tuesday, you'll feel a little guilty from having virtually destroyed yourselves over the weekend, which is absolutely what you should do. I plan on doing something very much like that myself. Now that I'm fully vaccinated, I can get out and make a fool of myself again. But anyway, the prompt is there. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. If it's confusing, feel free to shoot me an email. I've mentioned this before. I'll mention it again. Some of you like to do this. If you want to send me an introductory paragraph or something like that for me to look at before you commit yourself in writing, I'm happy to do it, even if it's during the weekend. I'm going to be home this weekend. I got a new amplifier coming that I got to try out. And so I'm going to be here annoying my neighbors with high frequency noise. I don't actually. I actually play remarkably quietly. I am maybe the world's quietest electric guitarist. But yeah, this was a good class. A lot of information that was summarized pretty damn elegantly. And this is the way to do it. This is good. I'm in a good mood now. I'm gonna go do something fun. Well done, seriously, to everybody. And we'll pick it up again. Next week. Okay. All right. Have a great weekend. Get some rest. Come back refreshed. And we'll wrap this thing up.
Thank you.